All right, so I think we're just a few minutes away from starting the live stream. Okay.
Okay, great.
Okay, and like before, come out to camera 1, and then when you introduce him, it'll be up to the entire time.
Okay.
Okay.
And for those who are with us on Facebook right now, you're getting a behind-the-scenes look.
Yeah, this is how I guess the way the sausage is made, right?
Yeah, sure.
Kind of. Yeah. No, out of bounds, repercussions from redistricting. So we're going to start our special in just a bit, and we're excited to have everybody on. And yeah, please ask questions because this is an ongoing conversation, which, by the way, doesn't end after this hour.
No, not at all. Yeah, we want to continue this conversation and see where it takes us.
Yeah, yeah. So write your comments online, write us on Facebook, write to the station. Just keep it PG. Thanks.
Well, now I understand we're live on YouTube and Facebook. That's great. What we're doing right now is waiting to go live on KSAT.com and the KSAT TV app, which should be happening momentarily after one of those notifications gets sent out that we're starting.
Yeah, so this is perfect time to take a bathroom break, get yourself a glass of water, something.
Yeah, get your redistricting popcorn handy.
Yeah,
and,
there you go.
Yeah.
There you go.
You look at them and you're thinking, well, they should all be kind of like somewhat contiguous and square, but then when you see one that kind of looks like a snake or something like that, you're kind of wondering, well, what's the logic behind that?
You should provide maps, draw maps that are more compact to those communities.
Most people don't pay attention, probably because they feel like it doesn't affect them.
It has a lot to do with money and what people can get from their member of Congress. It has an impact.
You have a situation where the politicians are choosing the voters when what we should be seeing is the voters choosing the politicians.
Redistricting. That's what all those people were talking about. It is a hot topic right now because several civil rights groups are suing the state of Texas for the way our leaders are handling it.
So tonight we're going to focus on redistricting, what it is, and how it affects you. Now, this is something that we here at KSAT have been following since the beginning of the year.
Yeah, absolutely. Back in February, KSAT Explains looked at the entire redistricting process. We spoke with Nina Perales from the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund. She put it simply.
Redistricting has to do with the boundaries that are drawn for our election districts. So anything that we elect by district could be state representative, state senate, Congress, school board, city council. All of those districts get redrawn every 10 years after the census to make sure that there are roughly the same number of people from district to district, and that creates equality of representation.
Yeah, after all, that is the intention, right? So here's a look right now at the census data for Texas. We know that since 2010, we've gained about 4 million people, which is huge, and that's giving us 2 additional seats in Congress. Now we have 38 representatives in the House.
So let's zero in on Bexar County now. Over the last decade, the population here has grown by about 300,000 people. When you break it down by race or ethnicity, more than half of those people, 180,000, are Hispanic or Latino. That group has far outpaced the white population, which has grown by about 16,000. The Black and African American population also up in Bexar County by close to 30,000 people. And we have 25,000 more Asians now than we did 10 years ago.
All right, so you're probably wondering, why are race and ethnicity so important? Well, they are, and you're about to see why. Just look at these numbers, because back in 2014, the Pew Research Center released a study that looked at party affiliation by race and ethnicity, and these were the results. Almost 60% of white people are Republican or tend to lean more conservative. The Latino population leans a little bit more Democrat, with 44% and 25% being more conservative. As for the Black population in Texas, almost 80% identified as Democrats, and just under 10% said they were Republican. So now that you have all of that information, we're going to discuss this with our panelists from Trinity University. Let's welcome Dr. Jesse Crosson, an assistant professor of political science. Dr. Crosson has done extensive research into Congress and public policy, and you could also read his work in several political science publications.
Also here, a great friend of KSAT, Dr. Carey Latimore. He's the associate history professor and teaches African American studies. Dr. Latimore, also an award-winning academic and author. Gentlemen, thank you very much for being here and being part of this discussion. Dr. Crosson, I want to start with you first. When we talk about redistricting and people think it's a complicated process or that it's, you know, something that they're not, I mean, it's basically redrawing boundaries, right? That's why we called this out of bounds. Is that accurate in how we're defining this?
It is accurate. And on the face, it sounds very, very simple. But over the years, we've had many case law lawsuits and so on and so forth that have put rules on top of where boundaries can and cannot be drawn. And this has made it much more complicated than you might think. When you just say it's just boundaries or it's just drawing around areas, it has become a very complicated process.
I'm glad that you mentioned that. You mentioned lawsuits because right now the state of Texas is facing several lawsuits over the way that it drew these new maps. Is it likely that anything will come of this? And I'm asking this because every time these maps get redrawn, we do expect lawsuits. But what's the outcome usually?
Yeah, so two things. The first is that the map as drawn is almost never the one that basically we get stuck with for 10 years until the next census. There's almost always some changes that happen. And the second thing I wanted to mention is that it is even more likely to be the case this time because this is our first year of redistricting after the Voting Rights Act or provisions of the Voting Rights Act expired in Congress. So it used to be that Texas had to have its map reviewed by the Department of Justice every single 10-year period. That is no longer the case. And so you can expect an especially large amount of legal activity around our map here in Texas relative to in years past.
Dr. Crosson, just elementary wise, I mean, from my understanding, when this goes to the courts, will it work its way through the state courts first and then the federal courts, or does it go right to the federal courts, and could the Supreme Court end up hearing some of these arguments?
Yeah, the Supreme Court definitely could. The Supreme Court always has a preference for the state courts to be able to handle this kind of thing. In my home state of Pennsylvania, the state courts have gone back and forth with the state legislature several times about maps in the past. But as the court of last resort, the Supreme Court could potentially step in, especially because there are major racial concerns of racial equality that are implied by the drawing of the maps in a state like Texas.
All right, so Dr. Carey Latimore, we want to bring you in right now because this is the perfect segue. It's impossible to talk about redistricting without bringing up the issue of race. And the reason that redistricting is such a charged subject is because opponents to these maps, these new maps in Texas, are arguing that the impact of the vote of people of color is being diluted. Now, but we really want to zero in here and explain how that impacts people in San Antonio specifically.
So one of the things as we think about, if you think about the impact of votes being diluted, when you draw a district up, one of the things that people know is the numbers that you provided earlier. We can tend to assume where they may vote. And so if you draw a district in a way that does not perhaps grant equality in regards to race or ethnicity, with those districts and you dilute that vote, especially if that vote is where the new votes are coming from, you've kind of diluted the impact of the African American and Latino and the Asian votes. Historically, that's a very important part because we've seen historically that race and ethnicity have been large reasons for what we refer to as gerrymandering. So you can gerrymander certain groups out, or you can gerrymander them into very limited districts, if that makes sense. So you can either spread them out across districts into where their vote is diluted, or you can place them in one giant district and where all of their votes are basically included, if that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense. And what I'm curious about, though, is, we're talking about the population growth in the state of Texas. We showed the numbers earlier. 95% of that growth comes from people of color. So the way the map stands now, and you can correct me, Dr. Latimore, if you want to, but it does not look like that's reflected in this map.
Correct. And one would expect that if that's where the population growth is occurring, those two seats, one would assume that those two seats would reflect those changes in the Texas population. And I should also say, in 2010, we had a similar situation occur. And I think there were 4 seats in which were not reflected in how the districts are drawn out as well. And so when you think about one person, one vote, or the increase, one would assume that the increase would be reflected in the way that the districts are drawn to assure equity.
Let's take a look at one of the districts that we're talking about. And Dr. Crosson, I want to bring you in on this. I mean, when you talk about the 95% growth in the state of Texas and not being represented necessarily in the map, this is Congressional District 35. You can see the current map. You can see the newly enacted map. This is Lloyd Doggett's old and new district. Do you have any doubt that this is going to end up in the Supreme Court?
Well, I'm not going to predict what the Supreme Court's going to do. That's a good way to go broke really fast.
Yeah.
But I will say that if you look at the old version of Texas 35, it also looks very serpentine like it does right now. And so one thing that's worth noting is just because a district looks funny does not necessarily mean that it has broken some sort of law. It does not necessarily mean that it is going to harm a minority racial group. In fact, some of the funniest looking districts, such as the one I used to live in West Chicago, was federally gerrymandered by a panel of judges in order to ensure that it would be a majority African-American district. Because the idea would be that the African-American population would be more likely to be represented by another member of the African-American community. And in fact, there's case law on this to suggest that if you can create a majority minority district, by law you should. And so sometimes this is when you get some of the funniest looking districts. Incidentally, this is why I actually think that many of the districts in San Antonio are probably on safer ground than, for example, in Dallas, where it seems pretty clear that major components of the Latino population up there is getting what we would call cracked across several districts.
Interesting.
Now, Dr. Latimore, we want to point out that this is also a bipartisan problem, right? That this isn't just something that we're saying, oh, well, because, Texas is generally controlled by Republicans, Republicans do it. No. It happens in other states, too. We know we've seen it in Maryland and other states, too. It's usually the party that is in power usually gets to draw the maps.
Correct. I mean, and one thing with political parties, they want to retain control.
Yes.
And so over time, particularly since the 1960s, when we really start to see this redistricting and gerrymandering thing really take another level because of some Supreme Court cases, is that, those political parties in control have tried to retain control. And so we've seen a lot more safe districts per se, and a lot less districts that are quite somewhat in question. And so because of that, I think it's also led to hyperpartisanship as well. And so these districts, the way that they're drawn, have some kind of interesting consequences in them. And so both parties are doing, as you said, Maryland is doing it right now, considering I was reading something earlier today about Maryland and figuring out, are they going to kind of remove the one Republican legislator or kind of make his district a little bit harder? And so we see both parties doing it. But when you look at the South, in particular the South, which has a large history of this, and in Texas, we also have to bring in race and ethnicity as historical entities that have to be taken into consideration.
Yeah, and to those people who don't really understand that history, could you give us a brief breakdown with the the Voting Rights Act and all of that stuff? And it's how states that had a history of marginalizing people of color and diluting their vote, the Supreme Court said, okay, well, we're going to have to, you're basically under a microscope now, that whenever you draw new maps, there's a process for that. But that's been taken away, right?
It even goes back to Reconstruction.
Yes.
So if you think about when after the Civil War, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, quickly 13th Amendment outlaws slavery theoretically, 14th Amendment gives equal protection, 15th Amendment grants voting rights privileges to Black men. And because of that and Reconstruction, you had an opening of the franchise to African-American men, which scared very much many Southerners, because African-Americans at that time particularly were identified with the Republican Party. And so the Democratic Party, which is primarily under control, was basically a white party in the South, sought to craft districts, among other things, to kind of restrict the African-American votes. Violence, districting, redistricting, other kinds of schemes to kind of control the Black vote. But once Reconstruction was over and you had the Jim Crow era, which comes in after the late 1870s, the African-American population and the African-American vote was basically controlling many other minorities as well through poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses. And so you don't see in the late 19th century and the early 20th century much around gerrymandering and redistricting. And indeed, many states didn't do much of it until the 1960s. But in the 1960s, the Voting Rights Act is passed. We see African Americans and other people of color really registering in much higher levels. Mississippi goes from like 6% Black registration to about 70% in a few years. And because of that, you start to see redistricting becoming important again and figuring out how this new voting population is going to be part of the larger voting population. And so you start to see other kinds of ways to perhaps manipulate the African-American vote, to contain the African-American vote, or to allow the African-American vote to be an equal vote. And so the Voting Rights Act doesn't just cut out poll tax and other kinds of things. One of the provisions of the Voting Rights Act requires that states that had a history of racism in voting or discrimination in voting had to be pre-cleared, or areas that had a history of voting issues had to be pre-cleared. We call it pre-clearance. And so they had to submit that to the federal government, basically to the courts, and they had to be cleared before they could make any changes to voting rights or district maps. And by 7 years ago, that was changed by another Supreme Court decision, the Holder case. And so now you don't have pre-clearance anymore. And so states now have a lot of leeway to decide maps, to decide voting laws. And since the Holder case, we've seen an explosion, if you will, of states trying to shift around voting rights, but you also see districting maps becoming much more part of the conversation, even more than it was beforehand, because you don't have pre-clearance anymore. And indeed, the onus is now on the individual or the racial group to kind of prove discrimination versus being on the state or the county or the locality to prove that they weren't racially discriminatory.
And that gets back to some of the things that we heard in the intro from people that were talking about the fact that, voters are supposed to decide their representatives, not representatives decide their voters, which seems to be what's happening in many of these instances. And then just the basic one vote, one person, one vote, concept. So it's all of this. And I want to get to one of our viewer questions, because we really want this conversation to go beyond just the four of us that are part of this discussion. So I think we have a viewer question that we're going to take now. And
it's from Irene.
From Irene, how is this process different from the national representative districts? Dr. Crosson?
So if I understood the question correctly, it's not different. So basically,
same thing, right?
So basically, these maps are drawn by state legislatures, but the state legislatures draw the lines for their state legislative districts, so for their own districts, but they also draw the lines for Congress, so for the federal Congress. Now, obviously, the Senate is just the Senate. You represent the whole state, so there's no redistricting involved there. But they draw it for everybody. And this happens, as Dr. Latimore said, every 10 years. And this is the first redistricting since the Holder case, which is why you see so much more activity, particularly from racial groups on the legal end, or at least there's rumblings there'll be lots of lawsuits, even if they haven't already been filed.
I'm curious because there have been states that have tried to do it differently. I know, I believe, and you can correct me here if I'm wrong, I believe the state of Iowa actually has a computer draw up the different districts and then the legislature votes on it. I think the state of Missouri has a committee that kind of figures out how to draw their different deals. I mean, is there a perfect way that these maps should be drawn, in your opinion?
No, it's politics, so there's nothing perfect. There's only a little bit better and a little bit worse. But what I would say, so let me just give you a really good example, if you'll just indulge me in this for a moment.
Absolutely.
Okay, Arizona has an independent redistricting commission. It's half Republicans, half Democrats. Okay, everyone sort of agrees this is probably more fair than having legislators select their own district shapes. Okay, now Arizona is very similar to Texas in a lot of ways. They gained congressional seats largely because of an influx of minority voters. Okay, the state is approximately 63% white and 37% non-white. But in the map that has now been proposed by the Independent Redistricting Commission, only 2 of their 9 districts are majority minority people, 22%. And even more strikingly, 7 of the districts lean Republican versus 2 leaning Democrat, even though, as we know, Biden carried Arizona in 2020. And so how in the world could that happen? You know, is it that the redistricting commission is corrupt or racist or biased? No, it's because we have a geographic system of representation that automatically is biased toward rural voters. That's the way our system is set up. And because racial minorities tend to be in cities, Dr. Latimore mentioned what's called packing, pushing people all into the same district, right? So that you water down their vote. Basically, that happens automatically due to migration patterns. So that it's not very hard for a state legislator to make an 80% Latino district around San Antonio, for example. And that is what has happened in a lot of these southwestern states. Now, there are other cases, such as in Dallas, where almost certainly there is an artificial sort of watering down of the racial vote. I don't mean to suggest that this never happens, but these migration patterns and partisan clustering, which has only gotten worse over time, has really pushed us into these hyper-partisan districts that Dr. Latimore was mentioning before. And it's not clear to me, apart from us all moving to different places, how we ever get out of that.
Interesting.
Right. Well, we also know that what's the retention rate for Congress, right? For incumbents?
Oh, yeah.
Like over 90%.
Yeah, it's in the mid-80s for Senate and the mid-90s for the House.
Yeah.
And if I may just add on to Dr. Crosson, one of the things that's really happening is that rural-urban divide, and I want to just add to that in that increasingly, this is something that really began in the early 20th century, but it's been accentuated over the last 10 to 20 years. And so it's going to almost necessitate, for equity reasons, kind of odd-shaped looking districts, because if you look at maps, very few minorities or people of color are living outside of, cities nowadays. I grew up in a very rural area. I now see that where I grew up was a very rare piece of history in a sense. And so when you think of maps just aren't where people are living, and you can't just cut up an area and say that this person fits here, or this map should be here, but it's much more complex than that to really assure that each vote is valued equally. And we want to surely assure that rural voters get their due share, but we also want to assure that voters who live in cities and urban areas also aren't diluted as well.
Doesn't this, and this is a question for both of the professors here, doesn't this lead to the gridlock that we're seeing? Because if you're in an 80% Democratic district, you don't have to come to the center. If you're in an 80% Republican district, you don't have to come to the center. So you're going to be reelected anyway. I mean, am I reading too much into this, that this is leading to the gridlock that we're seeing?
No,
not at all. Go ahead, Dr. Latimore.
I was going to say absolutely not. And that's one of the things that we've seen lately is hyperpartisanship and the inability of, in this case, Democrats and Republicans to come together, because you've created districts now that really push one way or to the left or far to the right. And so because you don't have districts that are more, evenly divided, you don't have political candidates who are forced to come to the center. And because of that, you have candidates who are really playing to the audience that you have. And so that's another issue of maps in this kind of way, is that the center has kind of been abandoned. And so people who occupy the center, their votes too, perhaps are obsolete.
If I could just add on to that, if you don't mind, a lot has been made about the racial breakdown of the map, and I think for good reason. There are clear disparities in population changes and who's getting districts and where, and I do not mean to downplay that at all, but I think lost in the shuffle has been the following development, which is Republicans used to use cracking, in other words, spreading out Democratic votes. They used to use that all the time in Texas. That was their number one strategy. But for the first time, this map is majority packing. So what we see in this map, more than in any other maps in the past, are a lot of really safe districts. Compared to the old map, there are 5 more Democratic-leaning districts than there were last time, 2 more Republican-leaning districts than there were last time, and 5 fewer toss-up districts than there were last time. Even though we gained 2 districts, we have 5 fewer toss-up districts. And by the way, San Antonio is part of that. Texas 23, where Will Hurd used to represent, and now Tony Gonzalez is the representative, that used to be the quintessential toss-up
Absolutely,
district.
50-50 almost.
50-50, all that was always considered to be a bellwether district. Now, what is it? It's plus 13 Republican. Plus 13. It's not even close. And, so if you're somebody in the middle, like, who are you going to get representation from? It's not really clear.
Yeah, and even I mean, I know that obviously that district is the most pronounced because it was such a battleground district for every for both parties. And even Representative Chip Roy's district, that was even sometimes considered that it could be in play, has moved more to a safe Republican district.
Yes. So Representative Roy, Texas 21, was plus 10 Republican. Under the new map, plus 21.
Yeah.
There's one thing that I would like to bring up, because a lot of people watch this and they think, well, if I'm a Democrat and I'm living in a Republican district, do I get any representation? And the truth is that you are still encouraged to go to your representative to make those phone calls. They do have to help you. You are their constituent. If you have a question about losing a Social Security card, something,
right. Yes.
You can go to your office. They're not going to ask you, which way you voted.
They shouldn't. Yeah.
Yeah, just putting that there. So now we do have another viewer question. I believe it was viewer question number 2. And I want to go back to something that you, Dr. Crosson, were saying before. And Bridget here is asking, why can't redistricting be done by an independent committee? You mentioned the Arizona example, but why can't it be, if this is a process that has been hyper politicized, why aren't we doing that?
Politics is the main reason. So think about it this way: you're a legislator in say the Texas State Legislature, but it's not specific to Texas. Okay, what's your number one goal? I mean, it's to serve your constituents, but you can't serve them if you're not in office, right? So you have to win re-election. How do you win re-election? Well, you do it by not rocking the boat. If you won under the old rules, you'll want to keep the old rules in place, right? And so in order to get an independent redistricting commission, you're going to have to get re-election oriented politicians to voluntarily give up some of the authority that they've used to get into office in the first place. In other words, you have to convince a banker that he doesn't like money. I don't mean to sound overly cynical, and sometimes political scientists sound that way. I'm not being cynical at all. It's just the reality of the incentive structure that is before any legislature, not just the Texas legislature. So in many states, and I believe this was the case in California, these independent redistricting commissions happened because of referenda or ballot initiatives that were not put on there by the legislature, but were voted on by the citizenry. Now, we're not an especially strong initiative state relative to other states, but that's how you get around it. It's very difficult to convince the legislatures otherwise.
We have another question, and this comes from one of our Trinity viewers.
Yes.
So I want to make sure we give a shout out to our Trinity viewers out there. If San Antonio is majority Democratic, will redistricting affect us negatively? And if so, how?
So I'll take a run at this.
Okay.
It depends on your preferences. Okay. If you are a very progressive, very if you prefer ideologically pure candidates, if you're standing with Elizabeth Warren, or if you're a Bernie bro, or whatever it is, that was your candidate, you're going to love this map. Because Representative Castro's district was already blue. It's bluer than it ever was before. Even Representative Cuellar's district is bluer than it was before. We've got ultra blue districts. And oh, by the way, Trinity caller, we are now in a new congressional district as a result. We'll have Representative Castro instead of Representative Roy under the new map. So if you really like Democrats, that's going to be a huge change from Chip Roy. And so it just, but if you're a moderate, if you're sort of a center left Democrat or center right Republican, I'm sorry, but you're just not going to find anybody. Maybe if you move to Converse or Seguin, they just created a new district out there that is exactly 50-50, and it's majority Hispanic. So that'll be fascinating to watch what happens out there, because that district goes the whole way down almost to McAllen.
Interesting.
From Seguin. So who knows what will happen there, but if you're in the city here, it's partisan politics.
I've had Republican friends of mine tell me that they learned how to do all this redistricting stuff from their Democratic friends when they were in charge of the Texas legislature. So what about the argument, and I'll put this out to both of you, what about the argument that to the victor go the spoils? That if you don't like it, get new representatives. What about that argument?
I'll take this one. You could say that, but I think, and I take this, I don't want to say the word personally, but from historically, people who have been excluded by legal matters and sometimes illegal matters, that's kind of hard to say to those people who've been excluded from the process to the victor goes the spoils. Mm-hmm. And so for say an African American, my parents were not always able to vote. And so when you think about redistricting and those kinds of things, to the victor goes the spoils, that kind of rubs a little hard because sometimes even to the victor goes the spoils, things change as well. And so I believe, maybe for me, it's my own religious principles or whatever. I believe in the golden rule. You do unto others as you would have do unto you. And so for me, fairness is extraordinarily important. And it's not just if you have the power, you can go ahead and do what you want to do. That creates a response from the other group. And so I think this is part of hyperpartisanship. Both groups are seeking to pay back from something that happened before. And this kind of stuff only leads to more of that. So for me, it's an argument that it makes sense on one end, but long term, where does it get us policy-wise? Where does it get us racially and ethnically? And what does it do to build a nation? This kind of attitude of to the winner goes the spoils basically breaks us down, and it doesn't bring us together. I know that's kind of pie in the sky and utopian, but for me, that's kind of where I'm coming from.
I want to point out that's not my opinion. Right. You hear that all the time, to the winner go the spoils, and so that's why I'm glad that you addressed that, Carey. And Dr. Crosson, I think you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, I don't have any problem to the victor goes the spoils if the game wasn't rigged. If it's a fair contest, fine. But I'm not going to win a slam dunk contest with Tim Duncan. I mean, it just isn't going to happen. That's not a fair fight, right? We are a country of laws. We're a country of rules. We're a country of processes. And if those processes are fair and if they are just, then we just sort of have to deal with the consequences of them. You know, if your party doesn't win the presidential election, you might be upset about it, but for the most part, we accept it and we say, well, we'll try again next time. But to just accept unjust outcomes because they happened, basically, I agree with Dr. Latimore that it's not a very strong argument because it totally sidesteps the idea of whether the game itself was rigged.
Dr. Latimore, you mentioned a moment ago a pie in the sky sort of idea, what you mentioned, and I'm curious, how should these maps be drawn? In an ideal world, what should they look like?
It's hard to determine what they look like map-wise, but for me, I would like them, number one, to be drawn independently. And so I'm going to come back from what Dr. Crosson is saying. I think it has to be depoliticized as much as possible. But you also have to take issues of race and class and location. All of those things have to be taken into consideration, and we have the ability to do so. One of the things that's making gerrymandering easier is computers and the ability to create algorithms that can basically tell you by percentage what groups of people are likely to vote at. Well, that also makes it more easier, theoretically, to bring more fairness to the issue. And so I think that we can use that same technology, and we have to bring technology into this, but that technology has to take all of the issues of where increases are occurring racially and ethnically, and also where they are decreasing, and it must include urban-rural distinction. And so we have the technology. What has to be required is using that technology, not for increasing gerrymandering, but for enhancing equity.
Now, we also have somebody, you know, we're having this discussion here, and a lot of people might think, okay, it's futile to fight back. And so we have a viewer here that's asking a question. Is it sort of that you're saying that we have no control over redistricting? In other words, can the voters, can the citizens of this country get some control over this process? How do they make sure that they're heard?
You raise your voice. And so many things in our nation's history have occurred because of people who may not have had power raise their voice. African Americans during the Civil Rights Movement didn't have the numbers, they didn't have the power, they didn't have the influence, but they created coalitions because their stories were so important and people listened to them. We are a nation that has, for its whole history, it hasn't always completely listened, but it's often listened to the people who have not been in power, you know, and so people who may feel disempowered have the ability to use their voice. We still have a vote. We must exercise that vote and tell our people, tell our representatives in this republic, you know, in this state that we're in, but also in this nation, what we want. And so if gerrymandering is an issue for us, we need to raise that much more broadly, not just wanting more Democrat representatives or more Republican representatives, but wanting more fair representatives. And so it requires that center that may be left out, which is probably the 70%. Those 70% of people that feel left out by this process must come together and raise their voices and speak on the issues that they find important. And that means using your vote and not letting this kind of make you feel disenchanted, but allowing it to empower yourself to exercise the right that's been provided for you.
Dr. Crosson, yeah, raise your voice. Dr. Crosson, is something like what happened in California, where you said they had a referendum and they decided that they were going to change the way they redistrict, is something like that possible in the state of Texas? Can it be a referendum, or does it have to be a constitutional amendment? Or, I mean, what are we talking about in the state of Texas?
So with the proviso that I am not a lawyer, I'm not a legal scholar, I'm a legislature's guy. It is certainly possible that a law could be made here by the legislature, no doubt about it. And I don't think it would need an amendment to the state constitution. Even if it did, frankly, our constitution isn't that difficult to change in the state. That's why it's about that thick. But in terms of initiatives, I think that the legislature would have to approve of the initiative getting on the ballot in the first place. And if people are really interested in that, I can certainly go back and check. the better part of valor is discretion, and so I don't want to say for sure which process it would have to go through, but I know for certain that practically no state has as open of an initiative process as what California does.
Yeah, and I didn't mean to.
It's just very easy.
Yeah, I apologize for putting you on the spot, but I was curious.
No, that's okay. My students do it all the time.
Yeah, I was curious if there's a way to go around the politicians, because, like you said, it's like asking a banker not to like money. I mean, it's is there a way to go around the politicians and get redistricting changed? And it seems like maybe there's not in the state of Texas.
Well, no, not really. And I mean, to Dr. Latimore's point, we use politician like a dirty word. And obviously, I was making a caricature there. But, I mean, what's good for the politician is getting reelected. And we're the ones that do the reelecting, right? And so if we don't like it, we have to raise it as an issue. There's a great new book out there by acquaintance of mine at Harvard called Democracy by Petition. And he's collected all this unbelievable data on petitioning behavior by all kinds of racial minorities going back to the founding of the country. Like back to when enslaved people not only couldn't vote, but were considered to be 3/5 human, okay? And yet there was power in that petitioning that they did to raise issues and put them onto the agenda and move particular issues of justice forward. And that is still true today. In fact, it's even truer today because we've got Twitter, we've got Facebook, we've got all these ways to get a hold of our representatives and make our voices heard. So if it's something that you don't like, use your voice, like Dr. Latimore said. It's actually, honestly, easier today than it's been at any point in American history.
And one thing I could also add, I was going to say, is my understanding, there's really no public input in Texas on the issue of redistricting. And I think some states do have public input. And so could the public, if the politicians won't give up the power to an independent commission, are there ways of having more public input that can be taken into consideration? That might be one more step beyond what we have right now, which is basically, the legislature does it, it's approved by the governor, boom, boom. You could have more public input that has a role. And if you have public input, then if your legislator doesn't approve, then you've got your legislator on the record for not approving what the public may want. And so it's another way of getting accountability from your legislator in a process that really doesn't permit much accountability, because there's no point of where the public is actually saying anything really about the maps. It's interest groups that are saying that the maps aren't right. And so if you have the more public activity on the maps, you could then put the representatives and legislators on the task for responding and defending these maps.
I want to dovetail to the points that Dr. Crosson and Dr. Latimore just made. I mean, you were talking just a few minutes ago about tweeting, social media, the power that people have, but it seems that usually when it comes to social issues, culture war issues, that's what you see being debated right now on Twitter. Not really things of, not always, not most of the time, things of significant importance. So well, I think for people, it's what, I mean, is it boots on the ground? Is that the solution? Protests, people, when you were talking about petitioning, things like that?
Petitioning, demonstrating, absolutely. I would humbly submit to Dr. Latimore, there should be more endowed lectures on this kind of thing by professors. Totally would be, that would solve everything. I'm just kidding. Yeah. But yes, all of the demonstrating, petitioning. You know what the strongest signal is to a legislator is not sending a tweet. It's not even writing them a letter. It's picking up the phone and calling them. And to my the undergraduates who are listening here, there's this thing called a phone, and you can actually talk to people through it. That you don't have to type anything. You can actually talk.
The thing you
and
used
it
to
seems
take pictures of your
old-fashioned, but
food
it's
on.
so much more effective.
Yeah, the thing you use Google for, you can actually call with as well.
Exactly.
And just as I'm going to date myself here, and I could be wrong, but I believe when Jeff Wentworth was a state senator, he actually proposed the idea of a computer drawing out the districts in the state of Texas, and it never went anywhere. and hasn't been a state senator for quite some time. I believe he's a judge now, but so it has been broached in the legislature of Texas before, but didn't go anywhere.
But we also know that that wouldn't necessarily guarantee fairness, correct? If you have a computer-generated map.
Well, a computer is a human creation. Computer scientists say garbage in, garbage out. If you put racist algorithms into a computer, you're going to get racist stuff out on the back end. But you can build an algorithm mathematically. I actually believe we have some faculty here at Trinity in the math department who've worked on this. You can build a mathematical algorithm that advantages certain types of outcome. You can have it try to maximize toss-up districts. You can have it try to maximize majority-minority districts. You can have it try to maximize partisan districts if that's what you want. And so it's actually just a matter of fine-tuning the algorithm. So to Dr. Latimore's point, you can use a computer for evil or you can use it for good. It's just a tool like anything else.
Now, Dr. Latimore, I wanted to bring in another issue of race when we talk about the school board, those types of elections, those districts and things like that. We know that that certainly affects children of color in this state, because we know that 52% of students who are enrolled in public schools here in the state of Texas are Hispanic. So when we talk about the issue of how this affects all of us, public education, when these maps are being redrawn, I mean, these are representatives that you choose that are going to have an impact on what your children are learning.
Absolutely. And I think that that's one of the reasons why, you may say that redistricting is not the most sexy topic to talk about, but it is important. And I think because it includes things like school boards that we're now seeing are extremely important. And so to me, it requires more voter training on behalf of the voter and knowing what we're voting for and what we're not talking about. And so we're only talking about these issues that are kind of tangential to the real issues. We're leaving out majorly important issues that are affecting our children, and basically that are kind of leaving the 70% of people in the center outside of the conversation. And so for me, you were asking Myra about what are the kinds of things that we must do. To me, it requires going across that Democrat-Republican liminal zone and creating and building coalitions in which there are people on both sides who I believe would say that what's happening here is not right, and finding those kinds of coalitions and communicating. That's what happened in the civil rights movement, was those building of coalitions of different kinds of people. And one of the things I think that's happened more recently is that we've lost that ability of reaching across and building broader coalitions. And we've kind of bought into the kind of gerrymandered idea of coalitions of people of the same thought. And that's one of the problems of Twitter and Facebook and others, is that it allows for too much like-minded thought and we don't bridge. We must find a way to bridge more than just having like-minded thought and canceling thought that we don't agree with.
I agree, and that's why we're having this conversation. Like you said, and Steph said it earlier, it's not a sexy topic, but that doesn't mean it's not important. And it doesn't mean that we don't need to be more educated on exactly what is happening with redistricting in our state and across the country. And I think we have one more viewer question that I want to make sure that we get to. This is the third viewer question from the KSAT viewers. Are district lines drawn by population number so that each district represents approximately the same number of constituents, or are there other factors?
So yes to both of those questions. So there was a Supreme Court case a number of years ago that said one person, one vote is the law of the land. That means that you can't have some districts that are 300,000 people and some that are 600,000. The average congressional district today is about 750,000 people. And that's, of course, the case in Texas because we have so many districts. It's not hard for us to create districts of that size. Now, there are lots of other considerations, and Dr. Latimore can get into a ton of them. There is the fact that districts have to be contiguous. So you can't just draw an island somewhere and say, oh, that's part of this other district. It doesn't work like that. They have to be as compact as they possibly can be, with some exceptions. The exceptions being if you're making a majority-minority district. They are supposed to respect geographic lines as much as they can. So you really are supposed to try to keep Bexar County with Bexar County, and so on and so forth. Councils with councils as much as you possibly can. But of course, in practice, this doesn't happen. So the new map, for example, 281 is a line, and Hildebrand is a line. So if you're from the middle part of the city here, you'll know that Incarnate Word is going to be in Chip Roy's district, and Trinity is going to be in Castro's district. So is there a real cultural difference between to the east of 281 and to the west? Probably not. But we at least know that they're the same size population wise.
Okay, now we want to go to our final question, and I will pose this to both of you, but I'll go to you, Dr. Latimore. There's a reason that we are having this discussion now. We know that redistricting affects each and every one of us, but the thing is, for a lot of people, their eyes just glaze over when you just bring up the word redistricting. So before we leave this discussion tonight, what do you want people to take away from this?
Well, that's a very deep question, but I think I would want people to take away from this that the one person, one vote is one of the most precious things we have in our nation. And it's something that for so many people, they've not always had that opportunity to have. And so voting, the opportunity to vote, the process is part of being a citizen. And it's extraordinarily important, and we should always want it to be allowed for everybody who has that opportunity to do so. And so this may not be the most sexy topic, but it is extraordinarily important to the sustainability, in a sense, of our nation. A sustainable nation, a nation that's working well, a political system that's working well, tries to build into it as much fairness as possible. And that's going to be difficult because of all the things that Professor Crosson has talked about. I mean, how do you talk about the difference of one side of a street versus another side of a street? The fact that we're becoming more rural versus urban, and how do you do it? I think that there are ways of doing it. And I believe that one of the things that we should leave here thinking of is that it's possible to do it. We have the ability with the computers, the algorithms, we have the ability to make it more equitable. We should want to do it, not for party, not for race, not for people, but for what is right. And for me, that's what I want people to leave here thinking of is how can I make the system work better, not for me per se, but for all of us. It's not what I want, but for all of us. It's not just if I'm the winner in a political election, but it's for all of us. That's what's going to take us to the next level. That's what's going to make us a better nation. It's doing it for the least of these, but also for everybody, and that everybody is included in becoming a part of this broader conversation. So I'm hoping that that's what we can bring out of this conversation, that different people can communicate, that they can move forward, and that all of us have an investment in ensuring that this is done right.
Dr. Crosson?
Well, initially, I was glad that you asked Dr. Latimore first because it was a difficult question, and then he gave a great answer, and now whatever I say is going to be a letdown here.
Try to top it, yeah.
But I would say this, I say this to my students all the time, and that is that institutions matter, rules matter a lot. Now, all of you have said this is not a sexy topic, but to a political scientist, this is like as sexy as it gets. And there's probably not a great
advertisement. That's going to be the takeaway. That's what people are
I'm a humanities person.
Yeah. That's all they're going to hear.
But what I would say is just because something sounds like inside baseball, just because something sounds like, political muckety muck, and why should I care about something so technical like redistricting, doesn't mean that it doesn't have a tremendous impact on the way that we live our lives in a democracy. In fact, according to a lot of people, democracy is nothing but process and rules and how well those rules are followed. And so, when my students take my Congress class and I'm teaching them about read rules and, the rules committee and closed rules and open rules, I know when I teach that, they first look at me and they're like, Dr. Crosson, when am I ever going to need this? And the answer is that all of this stuff, all of the laws that govern you as an American citizen, whether it's big stuff like Medicare and the Voting Rights Act and Social Security and some of the big ones you recognize, or whether it's smaller stuff. All of that is the result of a big old sausage machine that's pushing out the end product. And the end product that you get is a function of how you've built the machine. And redistricting is an incredibly important part of that machine. And if you want to fix the machine, you got to know how it works. Okay. Now, I just happen to think that figuring out how the machine works is tremendously interesting. That's why I'm in my office at 8 o'clock in the evening on a weekday. But you don't have to be quite so passionate about it in order to understand why it's important.
Absolutely. What is fair? What is right? Where should we go from here? It's really up to whoever's been watching this and your own opinion. We're not going to tell you what to think. We're not going to tell you how to think, but we are going to have the conversation. So I want to leave it there. Drs. Carey, Latimore, Jesse Crosson, thank you so much for being with us tonight. And let's keep the conversation going.
Yeah, this was Out of Bounds, the repercussions of redistricting. We loved having you with us tonight. And even though part of our conversation is over, we still want to keep this conversation going, as we just said. So if you're on our Facebook page, you're on KSAT, we'd love to hear from you. Just give us your thoughts if you have any questions, because we do want to continue this conversation in the future. And have a wonderful night. And don't forget, we're still working here tonight.
Yes.
We're going to see you right back here on the Night Beat at 10 o'clock. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us.